Well, now to that new audio recording obtained by CBS News of former President Donald Trump discussing secret documents at his golf club in Bedminster, New Jersey. CBS's Catherine Herridge reports the recording is likely a key piece of evidence in the federal government's classified documents case against Trump.
Today, the former president defiant on the campaign trail.
We did nothing wrong. This is a whole hoax.
After CBS News and other media outlets obtained an audio recording where the former president 2 years ago allegedly shared with a group at his New Jersey golf club a sensitive Defense Department plan of attack on Iran.
It is like highly confidential, secret. This is secret information. Look at this.
The recent criminal indictment of the former president for the willful retention of national defense information includes a transcript of the conversation allegedly between Trump, a book writer, a publisher, and 2 staffers. The indictment says none had security clearances.
Hey guys, Adam is here. So what just happened, guys? These warnings aren't coming from political opponents or cable news panels. They're coming from the people who built Trump. The ghostwriter who authored the book that sold him to the world has spent years calling him a psychopath. The executive producer, who protected 60 Minutes for 4 decades, just walked away, saying he could no longer do his job under Trump-era intimidation. A former presidential campaign manager looked into a national camera and said the clinical profile of a psychopath was running for president.
I think the assessment was that Donald Trump would try and do some things to appeal to the middle of the electorate, to appeal to suburban college-educated women. He's not. I mean, basically we have a psychopath running for president. I mean, he meets the clinical definition, okay?
These are insiders, people who know what's behind the curtain, and their warnings have been consistent for years. Let's pull back the curtain on Tony Schwartz first, because if you want to understand the architecture of this entire warning system, you have to start with the man who built the pedestal. Tony Schwartz is the journalist and ghostwriter who spent countless hours locked in a room with Donald Trump, crafting the literary monument that would become The Art of the Deal. That book wasn't just a bestseller, it was a cultural phenomenon that transformed a real estate developer with a string of bankruptcies into a folk hero of American capitalism. Without that book, there is no brand, no television show, and arguably no pathway to the presidency.
I felt guilty about writing The Art of the Deal with Trump for 30 years. And I thought that I could get away from it by simply never talking about it, which I didn't. And then he decided to run for president. And I felt almost a calling or an obligation to say about him what I knew. And he got elected anyway, and I feel very sad that I did that. It's like, who would have possibly guessed at the time that it would be such a consequential decision? I created the Donald Trump he wished to be.
Schwartz didn't write this mythology from a remote office by trading emails. He shadowed Trump. He sat in the corner of Trump's office and watched him berate subordinates, manipulate business partners, and construct a parallel reality where he was always the victor, always the smartest man in the room. Schwartz witnessed the machinery of Trump's mind operating in real time, noting the absolute absence of any filter between impulse and action. What he observed during that formative period of Trump's career so disturbed him that he has since dedicated a significant portion of his public life to undoing the myth he helped create. He has gone on to major news networks and, with the cold, calm certainty of a man who has seen the evidence firsthand, labeled Donald Trump a psychopath.
Joining me now for our State of the Mind franchise, Tony Schwartz, co-author of Art of the Deal and CEO of the Energy Project. He's just published an article for Medium about the dangers of Trump during a time of crisis. Mr. Schwartz, it's great to have you with us. I have to say, I mean, just hearing that as somebody who has covered so many countries, authoritarian countries overseas, where the issue of peaceful transfer of power is distinctly and uniquely American, do you think Biden's warning about Trump trying to steal the election and the fact that he may not even leave office if he does lose are justified?
100%. He is, as I've written on Medium, he is a psychopath, meaning he is missing the two ingredients that are critical and common for human beings. Number one, conscience, and number two, empathy. So he lacks both of these qualities.
He speaks not from a place of theoretical political disagreement, but from the visceral memory of watching a man operate with what he describes as a total void of ethical grounding. In his telling, anything goes for Trump. The goal is always the destruction or subjugation of the other person, and the truth is merely a flexible tool to achieve that domination. Consider the professional gravity of this breach. In the publishing industry, the relationship between a ghostwriter and a subject is sacred, governed by an unspoken code of discretion that ensures the powerful will continue to open their lives to the writers. By shattering that code so publicly and so permanently, Schwartz made a choice that carries immense professional weight. He is not a partisan operative seeking a cable news contract. He is a writer who saw something so profoundly broken in the core character of his subject that he felt a moral compulsion to warn the world, even at the cost of his own standing in a tight-knit industry. His alarm isn't a recent invention either. Years before the nation witnessed the chaos of a Trump presidency, Schwartz was already warning about specific future behaviors. He predicted with unsettling clarity that Trump would never accept the verdict of the voters if he lost an election. That was not a party talking point. It was a behavioral forecast from the man who understood Trump's psychology better than almost anyone, a forecast that would later play out on a global stage with profound consequences. You cannot just wave that away as a coincidence. You have to sit with the fact that the very person who gave Trump the vocabulary of success is now begging the public to recognize the pathology he helped disguise as genius. But the story deepens far beyond just Tony Schwartz. If it were only one disgruntled writer, you might find room for skepticism. The truly terrifying part is the convergence of evidence from entirely different spheres of influence, all pointing to the same fundamental fractures in judgment and character. Take the instance of David Plouffe. This is not a minor figure lurking in the shadows of political consultancy. This is the strategic mastermind who engineered Barack Obama's historic ascension to the presidency. Plouffe is a creature of data, discipline, and carefully measured messaging. He doesn't launch verbal grenades for the fun of it. Yet, during the height of a presidential election cycle, he sat down on Meet the Press, one of the most sober and established platforms in Sunday morning discourse.
I think the assessment was that Donald Trump would try and do some things to appeal to the middle of the electorate, to appeal to suburban college-educated women. He's not. I mean, basically we have a psychopath running for president. I mean, he meets the clinical definition, okay?
And he didn't just criticize policy or temperament. He went straight to the clinical. Plouffe argued that Donald Trump met the definition of a psychopath. He meticulously listed the characteristics, the pathological lying that shows no sign of shame or correction, the grandiose sense of self that cannot be punctured by reality, and the terrifying lack of empathy that allows a person to inflict cruelty without a flicker of remorse. Plouffe was careful to say he wasn't delivering a medical diagnosis, but he was doing something arguably more impactful for a voter. He was applying a framework of behavioral analysis to a public figure, and that framework, he argued, was a perfect fit. This wasn't a post-presidency autopsy filled with the wisdom of hindsight. This was a live warning issued before the keys to the kingdom were ever handed over. It was a declaration that the personality structure of the candidate was not just unusual in politics, but dangerous by definition. And since that interview, the subsequent chapters of political history have not disproven Plouffe's thesis. They have served as a brutal, long-form documentary validating every word he spoke. Now let's pivot to the most recent seismic tremor in this ongoing revelation: the resignation of the titan who ran television's most feared newsroom. To understand the magnitude of what happened at 60 Minutes, you have to understand the institution itself. For decades, 60 Minutes was the gold standard of broadcast journalism, a place where the powerful were held to account not by screaming heads, but by calm, relentless questioning. At the helm of this machine for a staggering tenure of nearly 40 years was Bill Owens. A man like Owens doesn't just hold a job, he stewards a legacy. His entire professional identity was forged in the fire of editorial independence, the principle that the truth is broadcast not because it's safe, but because it's necessary. So when Owens announced that he was stepping down, it wasn't a retirement party, it was a distress signal. He stated, in terms that were as blunt as they were heartbreaking, that he had lost the independence to run the show in the way he had always run it. He was essentially telling the American public that the firewall between raw political power and the editorial process had been breached. We need to examine the environment that produced this resignation. It didn't happen in a vacuum. It occurred amid a suffocating atmosphere of legal and political aggression emanating directly from Trump's orbit. A monumental $10 billion lawsuit had been leveled against the network, a legal action so astronomical in its claimed damages that it functions less as a good-faith legal dispute and more as a blunt instrument of corporate intimidation. The lawsuit, centered on allegations of deceptive editing regarding a political interview, carries the potential to threaten the very financial solvency of the network if it were to succeed, regardless of the legal reasoning. When a sitting president uses the courts to seek the financial destruction of a news organization over an editorial decision, the chilling effect is immediate and pervasive. It signals to every producer, every editor, and every corporate lawyer that aggressive journalism carries an existential price tag. This is the machinery of soft censorship, where you don't need to seize the printing presses, you just need to make the cost of printing the truth too high to bear. Owens's exit represents the human cost of this pressure. It was the moment a lifer looked at the ledger and realized he could no longer protect his journalists from the dark cloud hanging over the building. Framing his departure as anything less than a direct consequence of this campaign of pressure would be a disservice to the gravity of what a free press requires to survive. When a show like 60 Minutes is effectively kneecapped, the damage echoes through every newsroom in the country. Smaller outlets, lacking the legal war chest of a network, look at this and decide that certain stories aren't worth the risk, and the public's right to know shrinks further. Let's step back and look at the ecosystem of defectors, because the list is long and the titles are serious. It's not just writers and producers, it's the hard men of the national security state who have taken off the uniform and spoken out. John Kelly, a retired Marine Corps general who served as Secretary of Homeland Security and later as White House Chief of Staff, has emerged as a severe critic of Trump's fitness. A man like Kelly doesn't operate on emotion, he operates on chain of command and institutional loyalty. To watch him break ranks and describe his former commander-in-chief as lacking the fundamental character to lead represents a historical anomaly in civil-military relations. He saw the decision-making up close, the rejection of briefings, the instinct to treat the levers of state like tools of personal grievance, and he came away alarmed. General James Mattis, the warrior scholar who led the Defense Department, similarly severed his silence, issuing a statement that condemned Trump's behavior in the stark, unmistakable language of a man who sees a threat to the republic. These are not squishy moderates. These are fortress-level security officials who once stood in the Situation Room and have since concluded that the occupant of the Oval Office was a danger to the very security they swore to protect. Beyond the military brass, we see an unprecedented wave of psychological assessment from the clinical community, even as they navigate their own strict professional ethics known as the Goldwater Rule. Thousands of licensed mental health professionals have felt such a profound sense of civic emergency that they have drafted and signed open letters framing Trump's behavior through the lens of malignant narcissism. They describe a constellation of traits: the absence of guilt, the sadistic pleasure in destroying opponents, and the paranoid belief that the world is filled with persecutors. While a formal diagnosis requires a private session on the couch, the behavioral patterns broadcast in high definition for the world to see are so textbook that the experts felt a duty to warn. They observe a man who cannot be shamed, who cannot empathize, and who cannot place the nation's interest above his own id. The synthesis of all these voices creates a composite sketch that is impossible to dismiss. You cannot have a ghostwriter, a campaign manager, a four-star general, a defense secretary, and a legion of doctors all describing the same fundamental reality without that reality piercing through the noise of standard partisan politics. The sheer variety of the observers eliminates the excuse of a single vendetta. A ghostwriter wants to sell his own book? Maybe. But does a Marine general want a media tour? Unlikely. The convergence of their conclusions is the story here. To be fair and to understand the resistance this narrative faces, we must articulate the counterarguments that Trump's defenders marshal because they are not entirely without surface logic. The defense roster often dismisses terms like psychopath as mere rhetorical slurs interchangeable with any other political insult. They correctly note that the word has a specific clinical meaning and that it is often weaponized against any politician who displays aggression. They argue that Schwartz, by calling Trump a psychopath, is simply trying to stay relevant and monetize his 15 minutes of fame decades after the book was published. Regarding the 60 Minutes resignation, they construct a firewall between the lawsuit and the editorial decisions. They argue that Owens simply retired, or that holding a media organization accountable for editing trickery is a legitimate use of the courts, not censorship. If a network demonstrably altered a piece of video to change the meaning of an interview, don't they deserve to be sued? In this framing, Trump is a victim of malicious falsehoods fighting back with the only tools available against a monolithic media bias. As for the generals, the counter-narrative paints them as deep state operatives who were never loyal and who are profiting from tell-all books that feed a hostile media ecosystem. They assert that the mental health professionals are violating the Goldwater rule to engage in partisan hackery, sacrificing medical ethics for social media clout. These are the shields erected against the flood of insider warnings, and they are powerful because they tap into a deep well of distrust for institutions. Yet these defenses crumble when you apply structural pressure to examine them. If we were discussing only the venom of a single writer, Tony Schwartz, you could say it's a personal grudge. But how do you explain the echo? How does personal grudge account for the fact that David Plouffe, who ran against Trump's party, and John Kelly, who worked for Trump's party, arrived at identical destinations despite walking entirely different roads to get there? The data points are distributed across time, ideology, and profession, yet they all graph the same curve. An inability to respect democratic norms, a pathological disconnection from verifiable reality, and a dangerous lack of inhibitory control. You cannot dismiss Schwartz without also dismissing Mattis. You cannot dismiss Mattis without dismissing Owens. The unifying thread is a direct physical proximity to power. These people didn't learn about Trump from the New York Times. They learned about him by standing in his shadow. That's not a media conspiracy. That's classical qualitative evidence. Regarding the 60 Minutes lawsuit, we must differentiate between a routine legal dispute and strategic lawfare. A $10 billion damages claim against a free press by a sitting president is not a search for justice. It is an eviction notice aimed at the public square. If the intimidation were merely about one interview, the mechanisms of journalism, corrections, ombudsman, public debate would handle it. But the goal here is structural. The goal is to make every boardroom in America terrified of greenlighting a story that might trigger a multi-billion-dollar reprisal. Owens did not resign because he lost a debate about sourcing. He resigned because the operating system he had used for 40 years, the one that separates the business of reporting from the business of politics, was forcibly overwritten. We need to locate the real winners and the absolute losers in this scenario because power dynamics are never static. In the short term, the victor is obvious. Trump benefits directly from the vacuum created by this intimidation. Using the dual tools of litigation and relentless public denigration, he effectively declaws a watchdog. When a program like 60 Minutes stumbles, the information environment becomes less hostile to him. Politically, he sends a chilling message to all potential whistleblowers and journalists that the cost of holding him accountable is total financial and reputational war. The legal ecosystem around him also benefits, as this becomes a proving ground for a future where wealthy individuals can crush scrutiny through sheer monetary force. But who suffers? The ledger of losers is a tragic scroll of democratic casualties. Journalism itself loses its nerve. The invisible hand of self-censorship becomes the editor-in-chief. American democracy loses a crucial accountability mechanism. If the camera eye blinks, the misconduct in the dark thrives. And ultimately, the American citizen loses the raw material of truth needed to make choices at the ballot box. When insiders are too scared to talk and shows are too pressured to broadcast, the public sphere is filled with propaganda instead of reporting, leaving the electorate navigating a fog of misinformation without a compass. Painting a path forward requires a sober look at the branching timelines of this crisis. One immediate trajectory is the normalization of this climate. Other networks, watching CBS's struggle, will trim their sails. Investigative pieces that could antagonize powerful figures will be killed in the pitch phase, not because they are libelous, but because the risk assessment is too high. In this scenario, the long-form interview dies, replaced by safe, access-driven journalism that trades truth for survival. Another scenario involves institutional pushback, where a consortium of media companies finally realizes that the only way to defeat strategic lawsuits against public participation is collective legal and financial solidarity, but that's an expensive bet. A third possibility is a political correction, where legislative bodies reinforce press freedoms, though in a highly polarized climate, that seems like a faint hope. The most devastating roadmap is the one where current patterns intensify, creating a permanent chilling effect that survives administrations. If the precedent is set that a president can use the civil courts to impoverish critics, future leaders will not hesitate to do the same, and the window for speaking truth to power slams shut for a generation. We have to circle back to the specific weight of these warnings because the past tense proves their power. When Tony Schwartz sat in rooms with Trump decades ago, he saw a man who could not process loss. He translated that observation into a public projection that Trump would refuse to vacate the White House if defeated. That wasn't a wild guess. It was pattern recognition from a human tape recorder who had absorbed hundreds of hours of Trump's unfiltered thinking. The fact that this prediction materialized into a real-world constitutional stress test elevates Schwartz from a disgruntled employee to a voice of prophecy. It validates his claim to know the inner workings of that mind better than any pollster or pundit who merely analyzes the public-facing persona. Similarly, David Plouffe's pre-presidency diagnosis of a psychopathic profile was not just a colorful soundbite for a Sunday show, it was the user manual for the chaos that followed. Looking back at the tenure, the behavior documented daily matched Plouffe's checklist with an almost algorithmic precision. And finally, Bill Owens's resignation is the closure of a loop. Critics had warned for years that Trump would gravely damage the free press. Owens didn't just confirm that damage, he became its high-profile casualty. He embodied the institutional burnout that occurs when a system built on integrity is forced to submit to a regime of intimidation. The cumulative effect of these insider portraits forces a binary choice upon the nation. We must decide which source of reality we trust. Do we trust the carefully manicured image presented by the man himself, the one that relies on branding and dominance? Or do we place our trust in the compound testimony of those who have built the brand, managed the campaigns, enforced the security, and produced the journalism that defined an era? These are individuals who have no shared political affiliation, no singular motive, and no unified organization. Yet they deliver a unanimous verdict. Keep this man away from the levers of power. The very fact that this decision is even a matter of debate is a testament to the disinformation currents in which we swim. The man who wrote the book is screaming that the text was a lie. The general who stood at the desk is swearing the orders were illegitimate. The producer who ran the show is declaring that the signal has been hijacked by noise. To ignore this cascade is to willfully blind oneself to the most robust and thoroughly sourced psychological profile of a political leader in modern history. Ultimately, this is not just a story about Donald Trump or a specific election cycle. It is a morality play about the capacity for self-correction within a society. When a ghostwriter emerges from decades of silence to torch his own masterpiece because ethics finally outweighs profit, when a storied news producer resigns a dream job because he refuses to sell out the principles his institution was built upon, these are moments of profound sacrifice that demand a response. If we meet these warnings with a shrug, we define ourselves as a culture that values entertainment and conflict over safety and reality. We signal to future whistleblowers that their sacrifice is in vain, and we embolden future leaders to ignore their own internal checks. The data is in. The clinical language has been spoken. The psychopathy label, whether thrown as an insult or applied as a behavioral observation, has stuck because it explains the inexplicable. It explains the lack of remorse, the tidal wave of lies, and the transactional cruelty. The men who know this best have finally aligned, not to grow their own power, but to warn you. The ghostwriter has broken his silence because the silence was complicit. The producer has left the building because the building was no longer a home for truth. The only remaining question is not whether they are right, but whether we are listening. And more importantly, what are we going to do with the terrifying clarity they have so desperately and so publicly given us?